it did feel like a last chance, really.
While I was trying to build Jog On, I worked part-time at a running shop. It was there that I met a man called Alan. For some years, I knew pieces of Alan's past, but never knew the full story. Recently, Alan hit a milestone. It has been 10 years since he left behind a serious addiction to drugs and alcohol.
My path was probably going to be overdosing in a squat somewhere.
Alan told me that he was finally ready for the first time in over a decade to sit down and tell his story. We discussed just how bad it got.
You know, they couldn't tell me whether I'd survive for like 2 or 3 weeks.
And how, in the end, running became an incredible outlet for Alan.
When I first ran for an hour, that felt like I'd walked to the moon or something. It just seemed ridiculous that I could do that.
As a disclaimer, I should say that this episode contains multiple references to drug use and self-harm. It's a heavy story, but one that ultimately emerges with a message of hope.
Exercise and running is just such a gift, and I feel very grateful that it's kind of led me to this point.
This episode is available to watch in video form on the Jog On Podcast YouTube channel, or you can listen in audio on any podcast platform or app. I'm Harry Morgan. This is the Jog On Podcast, and please welcome my friend, Alan. Alan, I think an interesting point just to bring up is running has become quite a big part of your life, but it's fair to say in your youth, in your teenage years, running was not a big part of your life back then. If you were to go back in time and tell yourself at 17 years old, 16 years old, actually running will become quite a big thing for you, you'll become quite an active person. Yeah. Would you have been surprised to know that?
I would have been absolutely shocked. Yeah, I would have put down my copy of Lord of the Rings, wiped my forehead and said, absolutely not. Yeah, no.
What were your interests back then? What were hobbies? What did life look like for teenage Alan?
Yeah, I was into computers and sort of like sci-fi and just a bit of a geek, really, to be honest. I was not interested in fitness at all. Didn't do any kind of sport. I actually stopped doing PE because we wanted to do more computer stuff. So they just gave up on us basically at school. So yeah, I hated sport.
Were your social groups formed around those kinds of interests?
At school, certainly at school, I was sort of in the computery. We had like a Doctor Who club. We're talking that kind of level of geekery. As I kind of got older, I got kind of more interested in like music and the goth scene and that kind of stuff. So friendship wise, it kind of expanded and kind of moved around a little bit. But yeah.
The Gothic scene, what was the intrigue there, do you think? Is it like an aesthetic scene? Is it musically influenced? Where does that come from?
I'd love to say, I think if we'd have asked like teenage me, I would have said absolutely it was all about the music and the authenticity of the experience or something like that. But I think the reality was I quite like the black clothes and the kind of counterculture kind of subcultures always kind of interested me, which I do kind of get with running. It's like a subculture, kind of something that sits beneath the kind of mainstream society.
Is there sort of a rejection of authority in that? Is it kind of like if you don't like authority figures, or like is it a kickback against the strictness of school and homework and things? Like, do you think that's born out of that a little bit?
I definitely massively rebelled towards the end of school and went from sweet nerdy kid into kind of unhappy, depressed, gothy, rebellious kind of kid. So
yeah, that's an interesting phase. The teenage years are, I think sometimes it's downplayed, but they're a really difficult period for the vast majority of teenagers.
Yeah, I think life being a teenager is really hard as well, right? Life got very complicated. I was very depressed as a teenager, I'd say. So being depressed and kind of like gothic music and gothic subculture and stuff, it kind of draws you in a bit because there's people experiencing similar things. Plus, it's quite exciting, like gigs and London and culture, and there's a lot going on for it. It's not just sitting in your bedroom being unhappy listening to the Sisters of Mercy or something. It's there's a lot of exciting things you can do, all night clubs and all sorts of stuff. So
going out in those social scenes, listening to music, was that like an alleviation from the depression? Did that help in a way?
Yeah, there were certainly positive and happy experiences within that. So I think within whilst being depressed and unhappy and being a teenager, there's obviously like uplifting moments, and they were definitely uplifting moments. I wasn't sat in the corner of a club like brooding or anything, so yeah.
Was there a thought moving forwards when you were younger as to what you might want to do career-wise? Do you think at that point you discovered enough passions, or is there a slight lack of direction at that point where you're thinking, well, what do I want to do career-wise, job-wise, educationally? How much of a compass did you have for that at that time?
Yeah, very difficult, I think. I never really found my thing, as people say. I always kind of assumed I'd work maybe in London in media or computing or I don't know, something. I just assumed I would go to university and then I would go and have a good job and earn lots of money. And well, I suppose there's definitely that side of me that assumed that's what I was going to do. And I think that's what was expected of me. But then there was another side that was definitely drawn to a kind of self-destructive kind of like just throw it all away almost, and not have a very kind of meaningful existence. Just completely absorb yourself in these kind of subcultures and separate from mainstream society completely.
Is part of that born out of a lack of direction? Does that feed into it because you think, well, I don't know where I'm going with this, so it gives you less meaning, and therefore you can do things that feel less meaningful?
I think being depressed can allow you to just throw things away sometimes as well, and feel that life is a bit meaningless and a bit worthless and things like that. And there was definitely an element of just feeling like it was all just impossible and I couldn't cope with the world, and I didn't want to cope with the world. And culturally, things like Train Spotting and films like that were quite big at the time, and that kind of level of just throwing everything away and just sort of being completely outside of the mainstream culture, and an awful lot of suffering wrapped up with that as well. But somehow it was quite seductive and quite interesting, and kind of, it just seemed like that's probably where I was going to end up, and not this like media job in London.
Yeah, right.
Thing,
Is there a self-awareness at the time? Would you have acknowledged that state at the time, or is it more a sense of confusion? You're not quite sure what you're feeling. How self-aware are you at that time?
I think it depends when you ask me, I suppose. There was definitely a point where I felt like my path was probably going to be overdosing in a squat somewhere. It kind of got that bad, like I thought that's just what was going to happen. And I was kind of, in a way, that's an easy way out, isn't it? Of having to deal with life and the complexity of life and people and jobs and all those kind of things. So,
but there wasn't necessarily a fear of that outcome. You didn't feel a sense of, it didn't make you reel back and go, I need to do things to avoid that situation? Or is it kind of, there's a meaninglessness, so you're like, well, that's probably what's going to happen?
I think with a lot of things in life, there's those two conflicting perspectives. So I think on one level, yes, I was really scared of that happening. That's a terrible thing to happen to someone, right? On the other hand, it's a very seductive, easy thing, and I kind of wanted it, and I wanted to throw it all away and kind of just give up on life, I suppose.
I guess take us back a bit in terms of when it's starting to take a downhill trajectory, because it is interesting that there's this early part of teenagehood, youth, computer kid. Do you have a kind of moment in time where that starts to shift more into the darker period, if you like? Is it a steady progression, or quite quickly do you feel like your interests turn elsewhere?
It's a tricky question to answer. I think I started drinking quite young, and in some ways it was problematic quite quickly, because it would be that kind of almost like binge drinking kind of culture. So I think it was quite normalized growing up in the 90s or the noughties to overdrink and to overconsume alcohol. So I'd say from a young age the drinking was quite problematic and kind of linked into feeling unhappy and stuff. But then there was a point when I was, I don't know, 16, 17, where it just went from, drinking too much to smoking every day, smoking cannabis, thinking about other drugs and kind of wanting to get involved in that kind of side of life and seeking out what seemed so exciting and yet so kind of scary. So I think in some ways it went downhill quite quickly. And then once I got to college, all those things were suddenly much more available and, easily to consume and acquire and all that kind of stuff.
Once you put yourself more in that scene, is it a sort of, whichever way you look at it, downward or upward spiral? Does it accelerate because now you're around people who are doing it? So it's kind of a self-perpetuating situation where people that are going to do that, so you're more likely to join them. And then do you kind of quickly get wrapped up in that world a bit?
Yeah, definitely. I think I started smoking cannabis daily very quickly from that point at college, but I was still hanging around with this kind of like slightly outcasty, nerdy kind of quirky group of people, which were really lovely people. And I didn't really fit in with them because they weren't part of that kind of scene, in inverted commas, the alternative stuff. So I kind of straddled two worlds and wasn't particularly successful in either, I would say. Like, I don't know, it just kind of was really. But I wouldn't say I was particularly good at being a goth and being involved in that kind of subculture or just the alternative lifestyle in general, the punk scene and all that kind of thing. But I wouldn't say I really fitted in with the other group either. And then they all went to university and kind of left. And I was kind of left with the drug addiction getting worse and worse and the drinking and stuff like that, and not a lot else really.
Yeah, that's tricky, isn't it? Like you say, if there's not something else to lean into, if there's not that hobby or that passion on the side of it, sometimes it can feel maybe like that lack of direction can then mean you just lean more into this kind of behaviour and more. Most people who've grown up in the UK know that a teenage experience in the UK, you come into contact with alcohol quite easily and regularly from a certain age, from the social scene, from parties, pubs, etc. But for many people, they try alcohol. Some people are more bothered, some people are less bothered. I think it's fair to say it's sort of a completely sliding scale. For someone who has, tried some alcohol, did it a bit during teenage years, but had a couple of messy nights, but nothing too crazy, Can you sort of help them understand, for someone like yourself, when you try alcohol for the first time, do you feel like there's something more impactful that happens, or something that gets you more interested than the average person? Is that a fair question, if you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess there must be, because it is an extreme. My consumption of alcohol got more and more extreme, but even from those early days, it was drinking to a level of blacking out and behaving very badly. I wasn't a nice drunk. I wasn't a good person to be around. I've lost, most of those early relationships because of my drinking. Yeah, I don't know. There's something about being able to change your mood and kind of have a chemical that you can consume that will change your mood in a certain way, although with alcohol it's quite unpredictable. There's something about it. It just feels really powerful for me, or it did feel really powerful for me, I should say.
Is that powerful feeling for the first set of drinks, or the first couple of hours, or however you want to measure it? Is it a positive experience up to a point, and then it sort of flips into something negative again? And then the next day, how do you feel? Do you kind of just go, oh well, or is it a feeling of like shame that you did it again? Like what's the emotion or the emotional journey through a night of drinking like that?
I think it's very progressive. So in the early days, you laugh off, you have your first drink and it's great, and maybe you get drunk with your friends, and a lot of other people are getting drunk and they can't remember what they did, and it's all a big laugh and stuff. But if you fast forward, say 8 years, 10 years, something like that, you're blacking out every time you drink. You don't remember what you've done, but you're pretty sure it was pretty awful. You're scanning your phone to try and...
that must be crazy, because you don't have the memory of it,
No.
so you're not quite sure. That
No.
must be a strange...
Yeah, my behavior would be bad. I would have no recollection of anything. I would have no ability to not get to that kind of blackout drunk stage.
Because you couldn't stop, essentially. You couldn't switch
Yeah.
it off and just go, that's enough.
Yeah, I have no off switch in that sense. Like, I cannot moderate my consumption at all. Like, or you can kid yourself. I can kid myself that I can occasionally, or I used to when I drank. I would occasionally kid myself that I could control it. But the reality was, it was always getting worse. I'd always drink more. And it would always be very problematic and worrying for people around me.
You're young, and you got yourself in your life to a much healthier position, and were able to go out and run marathons and all this kind of stuff. And I guess one thing to your advantage, I guess, is that at least it happened during a young period. There's people who finally conquer it at like 65, and they must look back and go, well, I've now had most of my life as a percentage, so at least this happened then. But so I guess health is an element of it, but what is the most destructive thing about that? Is it the relationships? Is it just the self-worth? Is it the actual health of it? Like what's the most negatively impact through going through that?
I think drugs and alcohol at one point in my life basically took everything. Like, I'd lost all my relationships with anyone meaningful. I got to the point where at one point I was drinking like over 1.5 liters of whiskey in a day, and I didn't feel drunk. Like, physiologically, that would have been incredibly harmful. Psychologically, I was just an absolute, mess. And things got to the point where I was so unhappy and so depressed, and I drunk so much, and I couldn't stop drinking, and I was flirting with other drugs, so I'd maybe give up alcohol for a bit, but I just consumed lots of other drugs instead. So it got to a point where I took like a massive paracetamol overdose and had a month in hospital, basically. So I had 2 weeks in intensive care with like pencil lines in my neck and stuff, and like dialysis and stuff like that. Had like a seizure and a stroke. So I feel incredibly lucky that I'm still alive. Drinking and the mental health stuff, but mostly the drugs and alcohol really kind of took me to a point where, they couldn't tell me whether I'd survive for like 2 or 3 weeks, and it was very unlikely that I would still be here. So not just psychologically and like relationship wise, but I think drugs and alcohol kind of took almost everything away from me, and it's very lucky that I have any of that left and now have a really good life. And I think to some extent that's why I wanted to come and talk about stuff like this, because it's not something I talk about generally very often, and I've not consumed alcohol or drugs in 10 years now. But I just want people to know that you can get through this stuff, and that there is a chance you can have a high quality of life.
In the depths of it, you just can't see that. You can't see that chink of light in all the darkness, I guess.
No, exactly.
The paracetamol overdose, when you look at that, is there a form of crying for help? Is it a way of communicating that you're in trouble, or is it just pure, I don't know, there's nothing really here for me?
I think that particular episode, it was so many paracetamol, there was no kind of cry for help. I don't think that was very much I don't know, people talk about it and they talk about how they have a moment of calmness and clarity before they do this kind of thing, and it was very much like that. Like, felt very calm, very relaxed, what about my day, and then, consumed all these paracetamol, and then obviously had a very traumatic period of time. And the people around me, it must have been horrendous. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine the few people that were left, how that felt for them. I think often these things can be a bit of a cry for help and an act of self-harm, but I think in that particular instance, it was very much
Which I think is the hard thing for someone who's never been through anything like that. That's probably the hardest thing to grasp. It's almost like it's easier to digest if someone says to you, yeah, but it was kind of me trying to get, but if you just say, no, it was quite a clear decision. That's a hard mental leap for some people to make who've never been to that place, I guess.
Yeah.
When you come out of hospital and you're thinking, okay, I've got through this, I am alive.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of mental switch at that point? Is that a punctuation mark in your story? Did things shift after that?
I think the thing about addiction and having an addictive mind is that things like that don't change. Well, for me, certainly, and for a lot of people, they don't change your behavior. So although I was able to moderate my drinking and didn't drink in the same way, I ended up using other drugs in other ways. So I became very addicted to opiates, benzodiazepines, like an awful lot of different drugs, basically, instead. And, you often hear about people that have very bad addiction issues, maybe drink driving with their kids in the car or just doing awful things that they're lovely people that often love their kids, and they would do these terrible things. And that's the nature of addiction. You can have someone that is so grateful in a way to be alive and has nearly lost everything physically. And yet still I couldn't stop. I still couldn't sit with myself and be with my own head. I was still using drugs and alcohol. Not so much alcohol, but certainly like drugs and opiates. And I got completely physically dependent on like opiates and pain medication, and at one point heroin and things like that. So it got very bad. Yeah.
From the little I know about this scene, it seems like people will make attempts to sort of kid themselves that they can quit by themselves.
Yep.
Were there attempts made by you where you sort of will wake up one morning and go, this is it, like I'm stopping everything? And how long would that period last? And did you hit withdrawal? And is that a horrendous thing to go through? And then very quickly you realize you can't do this?
I think a common misconception with some elements of addiction, certainly like the heroin side of things and stuff, is that it's not so much so you are physically addicted, your body is physically addicted. If you stop, you will feel awful physically, you'll start being ill. And that was a problem, but I could, I went through that and it was very unpleasant. But I was able to stop, but then I would start something else. So I'd stop with the opiates or something, but I would soon be back to consuming benzodiazepines and things like Valium and things like that in quite high quantities. For me, it would just get quite cyclical. It would just kind of rotate around these different things to try and not be with myself, really, I suppose, in my own head.
Were there other people in your life who also had these problems because you were in that scene, or did it feel like was it a lonely thing?
It wasn't really a scene by that point. Like I had just lost nearly all the relationships that I had. I used to go raving. Like the rave kind of subculture became like a surrogate. So there was a lot of like ketamine and more party drugs in inverted commas, but mostly it was me just using on my own. It wasn't any of it. None of it was fun. I didn't have a good network of friends. I had people that used drugs with me sometimes, but even then, mostly it was me alone.
Would it have been from quite early on that you could look in the mirror and say, I don't have control of this. It's very much something I can't control. Or is there a period of denial for a long time where you would have sworn blind? You could stop it if you wanted to. Like where's your head at on that for a long period of time?
Yeah, that's tricky. I think there are times when I would think, I can control this. And there were times when I thought what I was making was a choice. And there were other times when I thought I had no control over it. But none of that was consistent. It was always just blurry and flowing and kind of this big soup of confusion. And to an extent you can kid yourself, or I could kid myself, that I had elements of control, because I would stop drinking. I would go through opiate withdrawal and stop using opiates. And then I would just start something else. But it's a bit like smoking. I also smoked like 20 a day since I was like 16, 15 even. I'm not even sure. And I would kid myself that I could stop because maybe I'd have a bit of a break or something like that. It would just go around, really.
Is it difficult financially to support that as well? Is it a struggle both obviously it affects having a career, holding down a job, things like that.
Yeah.
But also, is it expensive to have a habit like this, if I can use the light term habit?
Yeah, definitely got in quite a bit of debt over it and things like that. I think you can go really crazy fiscally. You can, if you're someone I was never injecting heroin. I was always just below that kind of threshold, I suppose. Like I got to the point where I considered it and very nearly did, but kind of pulled back in time, I suppose.
What was just like the unpleasantness of a needle? Like, what is the thing that stops you crossing that line, do you think?
I'm not really sure.
Watching Trainspotting.
I love that film when I was growing up. That's not a great film to love.
No, I love it as well.
I don't know what really stopped me. I think I was very worried about losing an arm or something to an abscess, or once you've actually got the needle in your hand, it reached that point where I had everything and I was really thinking about it. But because I wasn't part of a culture or a scene or whatever you want to call it, where other people were doing that behavior wasn't normalized. So it was very much me on my own deciding to do that. And I don't know why I pulled back from doing that, but I was able to at least.
And you're glad looking back that you did?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because who knows what line that would have crossed. That's another level of depth.
Yeah.
That is that much harder to come back from again. I imagine a recovery centre has to look at how far has it gone, and therefore how long a journey do we have to travel back.
Yeah. I'd imagine if you're injecting hundreds of pounds of heroin a day, that's a very hard withdrawal compared to someone that's, using heroin and painkillers and benzodiazepine. I mean, still pretty awful, but you're right. I think there's other levels you could probably get to.
Most people that would listen to this, watch this, would not have this experience. So I think it's just interesting to ask you, when this is going to be a very rudimentary description of what I feel like it might be, but is it kind of like you feel very uncomfortable, it's a pain and you don't want to be in your own thoughts, and by taking this thing, it sort of forms a blanket, a mask, it's something that comes and gives you sort of a brief warm hug?
As in the effects of like an opiate?
The actual effects of it. Like, what do you feel like you were getting from it in that moment?
Taking like an opiate, like a strong opiate, is like having a warm bath or something, like the happiest warm bath you could possibly imagine. Like, your body feels amazing, but your mind can feel amazing. Although I would say that can often be replaced quite quickly, which is what I found because I was using benzodiazepines as well and things like that, like respiratory shutdown a little bit and feeling like you're starting to die because your body is effectively shutting down your respiratory system. So although you can get very caught up in the kind of euphoricness of recalling some of the more positive experiences, the reality of being an addict to these substances is that it's very scary and very harmful. And most of the time you're just trying to feel normal. Like, coming off of benzodiazepines is like experiencing the worst anxiety you can possibly imagine. Maybe you're going for that job interview and you're terrified and it's that worst possible moment, but you're feeling that for about 3 weeks constantly. Like, you can't sleep, you can't detach from that feeling. You're just constantly feeling like the worst thing is about to happen all the time. Like, it's awful. It's really awful.
Is that the one that stands out? We'll come in a moment to the recovery itself, but is that the one you pick out in your mind as being the hardest to have got off of?
Probably, actually, yeah. The recovery. In fact, there's a line in Trainspotting where he asks, I think is it Renton, asks for some jellies, which is Valium. And she says, no, you're worse coming off of that than you are off the heroin. And I think that's very true. Like, in my personal experience, having to try and get off those substances, I think it took about 2 years for my brain chemistry to readjust. The world was constantly not right, scary, and it's very difficult. It's a very, I think when you've gone that far, it's a very long process to get back to some semblance of normality.
That's an amazing thing, isn't it? 2 years as well to really start to feel like some kind of normality has got back to you as well.
Yeah, I don't think that's an underestimation. I think
amazing.
It was that kind of time frame.
So if we can, let's talk about the turning point, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You went to somewhere called the Priory. What is the lead up to that? Do you hit some kind of peak? And how much is it you going, this is it, versus other people saying, we think it's time for you to try something like this? Just talk me through the run up to the Priory. What's the thing that really means that a change is being executed upon?
It's hard to remember, but the trouble with benzodiazepines and other chemicals within that kind of family is they obviously massively affect your memory. So I know that I was using a really wide variety of what they would call research chemicals. So they were like benzodiazepines that weren't really classified yet. So they were all sorts of novel substances, basically, alongside the regular ones as well. I know that my usage got really chaotic and I wasn't functioning in any way. My understanding is that I was in a hospital at one point. I don't know where I think I might have been sectioned, or they were looking at sectioning me. And then I ran away from the hospital. And I remember being in Guildford.
Wow.
Weirdly outside Edinburgh Woolen Mill. That's my memory of that moment. I don't know why I was drawn to Edinburgh Woolen Mill. Desperately seeking normality, maybe, who knows. Yeah. It's really, really blurry and it's not something I've really dwelled on. But I think basically my family picked me up and said, you need to do this or we're all just done. Like, yeah, I think the GP was quite helpful because obviously you can't just stop taking these substances. I don't have a very accurate memory. I have a very accurate memory of being in the Priory on day one with a very scary lady who was searching all my stuff because they search all your things and you couldn't have your phone or anything. And it's quite intense kind of situation to be in.
How much on day one were you, as Alan, willing to be there?
I think I was very open to it. I think it did feel like a last chance, really. I think so, yeah. And I'm very, very lucky that from day one I was able to fully commit to getting well.
You've said to me before that possibly part of the reason for committing is because you had something that not every person that goes in there has, or a lot of people don't have, which is you seem to be quick to accept that you had a problem, which they say seems to be the very beginning stage. You have to be fully believe and accept it to begin with.
Yeah. This treatment centre particularly followed the AA or the NA, Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, like 12-step kind of principles, but with a lot of modern therapy and things like that involved as well. And, step number one is admitting you're powerless over alcohol. And if you can't get step one, if you can't admit and truly feel that you are powerless over these substances, that you have no control over it, that you will never be able to moderate your consumption of these substances. And luckily, in a way, because it got so chaotic and I'd been so near to death, I'd drunk to the point where I'd nearly died in hospital. Like, you can't really get much closer to death than where I was. I tried to then not use alcohol and use other substances to moderate my behavior. And again, I'd got basically in hospital again. There were points where it felt like my respiratory system and my breathing was literally just right on the edge of not tolerating, life. So things have got incredibly low. So I think I was just very lucky in some sense that I wasn't having to work all that out through multiple treatment centre periods of time, I suppose. I'd done all that earlier. And the people that didn't seem to do so well were people that kind of fought the system they were in and didn't accept where they were. And do you know what I mean? Like, you can really go down that path, or you can really admit you're kind of powerless over it. And it sounds a bit almost religious, because I'm not religious, I'm an atheist, but almost surrendering yourself to this process is so important, I think, to getting well, or it certainly was for me.
Talk me through the first couple of weeks there from what you remember. Is that a very difficult process? Do you see any positivity in it? You think, I've got this kind of mission and this goal now, and almost maybe it becomes part of your identity. My identity now is trying to get clean and get sober and work towards this potential future. Or is it a long process where you still struggle to see a life that's very different from where you've been? What are those first couple of weeks like in the Priory?
Quite scary, I would say. You're in this room with you do a lot of group therapy. You're in this room with strangers who have got horrendous problems, some of them, really complicated people, and you're expected to be able to talk about what's going on for you. I mean, I was so unwell at that stage. Every night I was hallucinating. I was like lying in bed, seeing all these shapes and colours. Like, there's no magic detox that just makes you feel fine. So physically I was in an absolute state. It's really, really hard work. It's really, really hard work to have therapy all day. You have homework after you finish the therapy. You don't really rest on your laurels at all. There's no relaxation. There's no spa. I think some people thought there's like a pool or something.
Yeah, right. You walk around in a dressing gown. Yeah.
You're not even allowed to exercise because you're not even allowed to drink water when you're talking in group therapy, because people, when they get a difficult emotion, will often pick up a drink to distract themselves. Like, not consciously, but if you see people during an interview or they have a difficult moment, they'll often pick a drink up just to have that break. But they want you to sit in that. So there's a lot of really hard therapy, and every night you go to an NA meeting or an AA meeting, you bust out to these meetings and then you come back. Yeah, it was really hard work and really scary.
Because you were saying that before this, sitting with your own thoughts was a very difficult task.
Yeah.
So I guess in a way they're forcing you to now be in that uncomfortable moment, which is partly what the therapy is designed to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really hard thing. I think for a lot of people it'll be a really hard thing to go through, let alone an addict. But I also felt very, very lucky that I was being given this opportunity.
That seems like maybe a key to your eventual success, is that you were, in amongst all the difficulties and everything, you were kind of grateful for the opportunity.
I think so. I mean, it's not a cheap place to be.
Right.
And, it wasn't, it was some of our money, but it was family's money as well and stuff. And I'm very grateful to them for that. It felt like there was a lot of gratitude there, and I did feel very privileged to have that opportunity. The Priory is associated with like rock stars and stuff, and it wasn't the rock starry one, but still, it's a privilege to be given that opportunity, I think, because you're not going to get that on the NHS. nowhere near. And you're also just around, people that are literally yellow from their liver failure, from their alcohol, and they still can't stop drinking. And you think, well, at least I've managed to overcome some of those elements. You see that it almost reminds me when I was in intensive care and people were literally dying around me, because that's what happens in intensive care. People are dying, and it's to get out of there. I just feel very, very lucky, very, very lucky.
I wonder if it gives you a perspective, because so much of how we see ourselves is based on who we're around. And if you've got the needle, you're sort of considering going to that level, but you're by yourself at the same time, you must look around and see normal people, a businessman walking past in a suit, and think, I'm not part of this society. I'm so distant from it. But again, going there and maybe seeing someone who's arguably in even a worse state than you are, maybe it does give you a chink of light to think, do you know what? Maybe this isn't rock bottom, because that person is yellow, and like, if, for example, I'm not even. I wonder if that shifts your perspective at all. I wonder if that helped you in any way.
I think everyone's rock bottom, because that's quite a common phrase used in the program, in treatment centers and things like that. Everyone's rock bottom is kind of individual to them, and I think they would argue, and I think there's some truth in this, that you need to feel like you are at your rock bottom. If you think you can go back out and use for a bit longer because you've still got a bit further to go, then that means you're not really going to be focused on getting well. So part of the admitting you're kind of powerless over these substances is also admitting that you've basically slunk as low as you can really get. And again, I think me being able to accept that was very important to being well. But it's also, obviously it's humbling to see other people, I suppose. But
it sounds like, there was one more level to go, and that level was just not being alive, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah. It had kind of got to that point. Like, I don't know how it could have got much more chaotic, really.
Yeah. Which is crazy, isn't it? You must have looked back at times and thought, how did I get to this point? In moments of clarity, you must have thought, how am I here? Like, how did this happen? When you think back to video game playing and being in groups, it must be a weird thing to go through to try and work out, well, what was the journey that led me here? Because this was not the plan. You didn't, at 10 years old, you weren't thinking, I'm going to be here at this point. Like, so you must reflect at moments and think, this is, just question it, I guess. How did I get here?
Yeah, and you do look at that. You do kind of look back at, your early addictions and kind of your life story, I suppose, and kind of how it progressed, and how have you ended up at this point in your life? What's led you to this kind of point? Yeah.
You've mentioned previously that maybe the starting point was based in food at the time, and that was something that you had an addiction to. Is it something that you sort of look back on and realize more now, looking back, that you did have a strange relationship with food?
One of my earliest kind of addictions, you might call it like a process addiction, is just consuming sort of high calorie foods, I suppose. And the pattern of behavior with food was very similar to drugs and alcohol. It was uncontrollable. It was to try and escape reality. It takes a real toll on your body in a way. It's obviously not as dramatic as getting blackout drunk and not remembering what you've done. But in terms of the physical effects on the body, it's still pretty bad. And my weight has fluctuated massively. And one of the big reasons why I got into running was to lose a lot of the weight. So I lost over 20 kilos during that first year of running. Like, there's a lot of weight to lose.
What sometimes people don't recognize is that you still have to eat. It's not like you still have to smoke cannabis. It's not like you still have to take heroin.
No.
So is there an element when you look at food that it's almost, there's a frustration with it because there can never be a full stop?
Food, I think in many ways, food is harder because there's no, like you say, you can just never drink again. I can't never eat food again. And you can try and like never eat carbs again or never eat processed food again or something like that, but it's not really sustainable, or I've never found a way to make it sustainable. So food has been this ongoing, I lost all that weight and it's kind of crept up. When we talk about my marathon PB never improving and things, and in part, that is because my weight has slowly tracked kind of back up and has only recently kind of come back down again in the last year. But the general trend has been this up, down kind of yo-yo, but an overall upward trend where I've kind of still struggled food, and then not being able to kind of regulate normal food consumption has been a continuing kind of ongoing problem. And it's very hard because it's everywhere and it's really culturally normal. But again, I just don't have that off switch. And whereas someone else will have a donut, I just want all of the donuts. And if they're there, I'm just going to eat them. And it's really hard to moderate that.
When you come to leave the Priory, was there a set amount of time and it's like your time was up?
You're kind of in for 28 days as far as I remember. Yeah, they might advise that you stay in for longer. And then obviously you'd have to fund that. But they didn't advise that with me. And I had a very good therapist who I got on well with. You then have a year of aftercare. So you have a year of going back once a week.
Wow. And that going back once a week for a conversation, therapy, checking in basically.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a big group therapy session with all the people that have kind of come out. And then you're also expected to go to like AA meetings or NA meetings and keep that up as well. I mean, a lot of people would say you should be doing that for life. I think that's quite an individual kind of choice and journey. A lot of people do sort of would always go. I personally don't, but a lot of people would just go to AA or NA for the rest of their life.
I'm jumping ahead a bit, but do you feel like you ever get back to 100%? Or is there always, you have to keep it in check because there is still something there you can never fully get rid of? There's that, whether it be a voice on the shoulder, just that little chink of something, that little bit of darkness, and you just have to keep it locked away. Do you have to still put some effort in over a long period of time to just make sure you are on the straight and narrow? Would you say it's like you can't even detect it anymore?
It's not a problem in my day-to-day life. I'm not worried any more than anyone ever should be who's been in that situation about relapsing or anything. Obviously, I am always aware that nothing's forever and that in theory I could be back there. I think that's very important to remember, that you could be back there. Not especially. The only time I had it, weirdly, was after London Marathon. I was working at the London Marathon Expo and I was in Canary Wharf, I think it was, coming back. And all the bars were open and it was dark and it was late at night. And there was just this little voice in my head that remembered the madness of that kind of, you're in London, it's at night time. You know, I used to go to this 24-hour goth club called Slimelight,
Wow.
which just had a toilet there and just did vast amounts of drugs in, basically, pretty openly. And it just, there's a little part of my brain that went, oh, do you remember the excitement of that? They kind of call it euphoric recall. But luckily, I think I'm quite good at, or I certainly try hard to just remind myself of the reality of those paths and that you're remembering a tiny moment. And that's not what it's like to be back in that situation. That's the tiny bit of euphoria you remember from when you were 17 and you first went and it was great. But that's not how it was. That's just that little moment. You know, that's the first drink in the pub. That's not where it ends up.
To even enter into any part of that world again, it is the top of a slide. It's not just this one moment and then another year of sobriety. It's the thing of, I put my foot on that and I'm going somewhere with it.
Yeah, and that's the total kind of acceptance of no control of it. If I drink alcohol, I will die. If I take drugs, I will die. That's the only place that's going. And it probably wouldn't take very long. And I've known several people that have thought they could drink again. And they've been dead within like 6 months, 3 months. Like,
that's crazy, isn't
you
it?
can drink yourself to death real quick, especially if you've not got those tolerances that you had when you built up over those years.
Well, exactly. That's the thing as well. Now you wouldn't be able to handle anything like,
No.
I mean, it was just a completely different level of tolerance.
No, exactly. So I'm always very aware that that's the reality of it. And I never waver in that. And I think where some people, it's very hard to speak for other people because you always want to speak for yourself, but I theorize that for some people, when they do end up relapsing, is they've forgotten where they're going if they have that drink. And they think in that moment they're going to be okay and they can control it.
It's very interesting as well, though, when I look back, that in a weird way, in a sort of twisted way, you could say that because of the depths and the extremeness of where you got to, it ultimately was one of the redeeming factors or saving factors, because it helped you to accept, because you had all this long list of evidence of clearly this is a negative in my life. Clearly I'm not in control.
Yeah.
So you could tick those boxes quite quickly. So it's strange that by going to those levels, when you were in the Priory, it gave you sort of a way out. It was sort of weird cyclical thing. It's strange.
That has occurred to me. And the way that some people use drugs and alcohol means that it's very sustainable. So they can be an addict and have a very dysfunctional life for their whole kind of life. And in some ways, it is lucky that it got so bad, because it does allow me this new life, which is incredible. And it's a wonderful life.
Otherwise, you could have been someone who kept in kind of rather than going to gear 5, you could have stayed in gear 3 for your whole life, sort of thing, where it never gets quite bad enough that you're running away from hospitals, but it's also clearly affecting relationships and being a negative presence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then I did almost die. So that's I'm lucky because I survived, but by the tiniest of whispers, that's the thing, isn't it? So it's,
you could not be here. I think where this leads to, Alan, and kind of one of the main topics of this conversation, of course, is running has become a huge part of your life. When you exit the Priory, how long after that before you start to even develop an interest in going for a run?
It's quite quick, actually. So one of the great things, I suppose, about coming out of that situation was that I had space to kind of work on myself. And one of the things I really wanted to do was lose weight and get fit. Joined a gym and I started running on the treadmill, and I started running for like 30 seconds and then just trying to build it up. And I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I was doing it in a pair of old swimming shorts, like kind of reef style ones, and a cotton t-shirt that would just get drenched in sweat. And it was horrible. And I just spent a year just trying to run a little bit longer, a little bit longer. And I remember I got to an hour. I could run for an hour and I was like, oh, I don't know what to do now. Wow.
I've completed it.
Yeah, I've completed running. Yeah.
Amazing.
I'm done.
Do you ever reflect on the fact that possibly it is your addictive personality that then has allowed you to pursue something? You can get quite focused on something and sort of chase it quite hard. So it sounds like there was a quiet determination there to chase it. Do you remember feeling quite motivated, even though it sucked and it was hard and you're in swim shorts? Were you driven?
Yeah, I think so. Some addicts, certainly from my experience, I am quite obsessive and I can be quite obsessive about unhealthy things, but I can be quite obsessive about really good things as well. And I think a lot of people that run quite obsessively, and not everyone by any stretch, but it's a useful thing if you want to run, isn't it? To be a bit obsessive about it and strict about it and all-encompassing about it, I suppose. So, and there is actually in Trainspotting 2, as we've discussed Trainspotting at length, in Trainspotting 2, he talks about running and getting addicted to running instead of drugs. And I think there's some truth to that. I've never heard it from like a treatment center or anything, but for me, channeling that obsessive quality into something healthy has been really helpful.
You end up progressing quite far, and in 2016 you actually do a marathon. There's a good parkrun time in 2016 as well. I've noted them down. 3:39 marathon near the River Thames. It was a meander marathon.
Thames Meander, yeah, Thames Meander.
3:39 you ran in 2016, and then you run as early as 2016. You run a 2023 parkrun as well. Was there any acknowledgement on your part that you also, not only were you committed to it and you had this new lease of life and things had really turned a corner for you, but also you had some ability? Did you recognise that at all?
No, not even a little bit. And I wouldn't say I'm a good runner in any sense, but I do enjoy it. But no, I wouldn't say that I ever felt that I had any kind of talent for running.
At the heart of Jog On is community. So around the year, we hold completely free meetups for the audience of Jog On to come together. If you ever want to join us, see if we're holding a meetup near you at thisisjogon.com. The hour progresses to the marathon. At what point do you decide, I think I'd like to have a go at a marathon now?
So I blame a running club called Blackwater Valley Runners, because when I joined that running club, which was, I think it was about a year after I'd been running in the gym, I said I'd never run a marathon. It's not healthy. Why would anyone run a marathon? It's an unsafe distance. Why would you do that? But they were all running marathons. And I swear within about a month, I'd signed up to this marathon. It can't have been too long outside of that.
Was that the first marathon you ran, the 3:39?
Yeah.
That was your debut marathon,
That was
3:39.
my debut marathon. Still my PB, which I'm quite bitter about, but let's not dwell on that too much.
What was the experience of that marathon like from what you remember? Was it a positive experience, or did you go, why am I doing this? I hate this. The last 6 miles sucked. What was it like?
I loved it. And I loved it. I was very excited to be doing a marathon. The wheels just really fell off towards the end. So I was on for a really nice time. And then I just hit the wall, as people say. But it was like running through treacle or something. My legs stopped working. I didn't know what I was doing. I did it in a very basic running shoe without all the right gear and stuff. And I didn't know how to fuel it properly. And I think when you've not been training at those longer distances, you don't have that endurance and stuff. So the wheels really fell off towards the end and I was an absolute mess. I was an absolute state. I did walk a little bit and it was a disaster in that sense. But the achievement, having done it, and I think marathons are very addictive. I really enjoyed running a marathon. I have done many more since. I loved it.
We're coming on for nearly 9 years ago since that happened, sitting here in 2025. Like you say, you went on to do many more marathons. You got your parkrun time down to 20:04, which led to you and I doing the trilogy project in which we tried to get you to run a sub 20, which you succeeded on part 3. When you look back on this sort of, well, I guess it's nearly a decade if you sort of started a year before the 2016. So if we're roughly 10 years of running and sober living, which is fantastic. What do you think running's given you? Is there do you like the social element of it? Is it just that headspace when you're out on a run? What is it that you've enjoyed so much about running?
It's given me a whole new life, really. It's given me, socially, it's given me lots of friends. I've had wonderful experiences doing different kind of runs and going to different places and, doing stuff abroad. Mont Blanc Marathon was just incredible. All these wonderful experiences. But also it just gives me something for me every day where I can leave the house and I can dial in and I can do my run. You get a lovely flow state, I find, in your head, and you can just be part of the run. You've always got something healthy to be working towards. There's always this kind of for people that are quite goal focused, you've always got this goal that you're working towards. There's lots of progression. It's not just a social activity, it's also the health side of things as well, looking after your body. For me, it's amazing to be able to run. I could never run as a child. Well, as a child, I could run about, but seeing people run a cross-country race or, anything like that just seemed insane. I didn't know how you could physically make your body do that. And to suddenly be able to do that, when I first ran for an hour, that felt like I'd walk to the moon or something. It just seemed ridiculous that I could do that. And the fact that you can change your body to do that and be that powerful and that strong, no matter what time you're doing, no matter what pace you're running, I just love that. I just think that was fantastic. And it's very addictive to see what you can do with your body. And I think to some extent people in society, or a lot of people that aren't exercising, don't realize what their body's meant to do. And it's not meant to sit in an office all day and then get in a car and drive home. And so many people are unhappy and depressed and they don't realize, or maybe they do realize and they just don't know how to get to that point. But exercise and running is just such a gift. And I feel very grateful that it's kind of led me to this point. I also work in the running industry now, so it's just become this kind of whole encompassing kind of life where I don't know what I'd have done now without it. So
maybe if you look back at that point at which there is a slight lack of direction, you're not quite sure what your thing is, as you said, is it fair to now fast forward to 2025 and say with at least if maybe there's other things as well, but running would tick the box of being one of your things?
Absolutely, yeah. I am sadly obsessive about running. Under my bed is full of shoes. I have way too much running clothing. My wife asked me to stop talking about my 5K strategy for the next. You know what I mean? I am a bit all encompassed with it. And at certain points when I had more space in my life, I've got a little girl now and life is quite busy, but when I had more time, like running's just a lovely thing to fill that time with.
It is interesting you make that comment about an addict. Yes, might have a very addictive personality. It can often be one of the traits that means they're more susceptible to certain things. But that addiction can be something positive or negative. Maybe I have a new drug, but that drug is now me using my body to go and run places, which sounds like a ridiculous thing. And I'm not going to be the pretentious person who sits here and talks about runners high like it's anything like heroin. But I think that concept is interesting to apply the addiction to something. And it seems like running has been a really good place into which to put that obsessiveness and that addiction. I think that's quite an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. And I do see it in other people. I see a lot of people with running, with addiction histories and stuff that get into running and find it very helpful. So it's an interesting thing that I don't think is discussed that often, I suppose. So I do wonder about it.
It's fair to say that you've had a very interesting life. I don't think you can ever describe your life as boring. And an interesting segment of your life was you purchased a van. It was converted. You started a YouTube channel around it as well.
We've always kind of fancied doing something a bit mad, and it just kind of seemed to fit. And we were watching like people on YouTube do it, and we thought, yeah, let's have a go. Let's get a van. So yeah, we got a van and we traveled around Europe for a couple of years, lots of different places, Spain and Portugal, and just toured really and just lived that, kind of nomadic life, did some races and yeah, had a great time.
All in all, looking back, when you finally finished, do you feel like you fully scratched that itch? Were you ready to leave?
No, I don't know. I found it hard to adjust, I would say, to living a simpler kind of home life. So as I mentioned, we've got a little girl now. If we didn't have her, I definitely wouldn't just be living in the south of England. I would definitely be doing something more interesting than that, I think, if I could make it work. But she's a wonderful thing, and that's taken up so much life that you kind of don't miss it. But it is still a bit weird to be confined to such a small section of the country.
Looking back, what's the massive positive of that lifestyle, and what's a sort of a negative that you don't miss?
There's so many positives. So if you like running, especially, and you like trail running, you can go anywhere. You can, in Europe, really, you can go to Chamonix and you can run in the mountains and you can just park in a lay-by and live there for a week. And you can be up in some of those beautiful parts of the world that normally can only be accessed by people with lots of money and a ski lift pass, So you can have a wonderful time. You can go wherever you want and do all these wonderful things. The hard thing is you're living in a very small van, probably don't have a proper shower, chemical toilet, all that kind of stuff. But Europe is very geared up for that. Like continental Europe, it's very much kind of van friendly as long as you do it right. So it's very doable.
I remember the clips of you trying to sort of shower out the back of the van and stuff like that. Do you adapt to that quite quickly and just think, well, this is life now?
You do. But my goodness, it's nice to have a real shower again. Yeah. So you're going for your daily run and then you've just got this little sink and you've only got that much water. And that's how you're going to wash your long hair, Standards definitely slip. So yeah, there's definitely drawbacks, but then you open those curtains in the morning and you're on the side of a mountain and you can go and do a half marathon route on your own in the most beautiful Swiss scenery, for example. And you're just free. You're so free.
Now, if you're running the same loop, there must be moments where you just have a memory back to a certain mountain you ran up or something and just think, oh man, that was cool, that life.
It's a lot to leave behind. Yeah. It's also not really sustainable because you do miss family and community. And I'm not particularly good at forming quick connections with people. So I didn't form lots of relationships on the road. So it was quite lonely and isolating.
One of the highlights, I think it's fair to say, from the running side of things on that trip is you went and did Mont Blanc Marathon.
Yeah.
You're someone who's passionate about the mountains, passionate about running in the mountains, passionate about marathons and ultras. So Mont Blanc Marathon must have been a big thing for you. What's the sort of back of a postage stamp summary of that race? I mean, that's probably hard to do, but like for someone who's never done it before, what's it like?
It's quite hilly. So, yeah.
Amazing.
It's so it's Mont Blanc Marathon in Chamonix, around the part of the Mont Blanc Massif. Quite technical trail in parts, but mostly quite runnable, but a lot of up and down. Everyone it felt to me like everyone there was beautiful and skinny, and they lived in the mountains, and they're clad in Salomon gear, and they look like they really know what they're doing. And then there's me with my kind of gut and some tatty old clothes and
sharing out the back of your van.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll be there in a moment, guys.
Yeah. But it was a wonderful experience. I pushed myself so hard. You know, the snow on the top, it was that cold. When I finished, I couldn't get my jacket off. My hands were so numb. You know, I was like bundled into a ski lift and straight back off the mountain. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But there's something about that physical challenge of pushing yourself to your absolute limit where you feel like you cannot take any more of this. And I find that very addictive, and I really like that in a good way. You know, it's a very positive experience for me. I really like pushing my body really hard. And there was a lot of that. And it's just, you know, you're running down ski slopes, so it's really steep and you can really open up and you're just flying down these beautiful slopes and paths and things like that. It was wonderful. Yeah, I would like to do more of that kind of thing.
And atmosphere-wise, when you watch these documentaries out there about trail races, big mountain races like this, is it just quite a thing to be a part of and just be on that start line with everyone?
It's very French, I would say. It's very different from a UK trail race. So they start you off at the start line with all this like kind of music and everyone's clapping and getting really hyped up. Like I was a bit like, what on earth's happening? You know, being a slightly reserved, kind of awkward Brit, but they love it. And it's not quite as grand as something like UTMB for those that have looked at UTMB and the crowds that draws, but it's in the same place and it's the same kind of thing. And, you know, going forward, I would love to have the opportunity to do something like UTMB and 100-mile races and things like that. That's, if we're looking at a direction of travel, that's what I'd like to get good at, I think.
It seems like when you look at your running into the future, that's the thing that gets you the most excited. That's the thing that gets the heart rate up, the idea of doing something that big, I guess.
Yeah. I'm always interested in running a faster marathon on the road, or I'm doing London Marathon this year and I'm excited to see what I can do. But what really makes my heart sing is something like UTMB or another mountain race or something like that.
It's great that you can identify that and you know that and you have that clarity in that direction. It's something to work towards, I guess, as well.
Yeah. And I love the way I can be on a start line. Like theoretically, I could get into UTMB and I can be on the start line with some of the best trail runners in the world. And it's the same start line.
You don't get to go on the football pitch and play with the top footballers, but you can stand on the start line with the best runners in the world. And I like that that's
it's great, isn't it?
Mixed with the best, and it's quite chill. I was going to ask you about future aspirations and goals. So it sounds like potentially faster marathon time would be
That'd be nice, given the PB is from the first ever marathon I've done.
Yeah. Another thing, UTMB lingers.
I would love to do that, yeah. And certainly some more 100-mile races. I've done a 100k ultra. I've got a 75k ultra lined up this summer, but I would really like to get to that 100-mile distance. But I'd like to do it properly. I don't want to like limp through. I'd like to feel like I could run it well. For me, you know, I don't mean win it or anything, but
yeah. I'm not telling us I got a shot at gold. Yeah, fair enough. No, I completely understand that mindset. It's the same when finally tackling a marathon this year. It was always like I wanted to feel ready. Could have done it earlier, but didn't want to sort of stagger through it. Wanted to actually like execute well on it. So I can completely understand that mindset. Dare I bring it up one final time? Doing the sub 25k in a race, is it parked? Are you just thinking long distance, or does that still?
I would like to get back to sub 20 in a race. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and it does sadden me because I'm sure I've been fit enough at different points, but I've never raced at the right time. I've been so obsessed with this is my marathon training block. I would never have done a park run, but I know I could have done a sub 20 in that moment. So I would like to hopefully get to the point where running a sub 20 would be a hard thing, but something I could achieve fairly frequently.
It is amazing how often we see people do it in the middle of a marathon block. They just happen to enter a race as just like a bit of a fun Saturday run, and lo and behold, they go and run a PB. And it seems like they've just built such an aerobic base. They're so fit. They don't just get fit for marathon, they get fit for marathon and everything below. It's an incredible thing to witness. But
yeah, I think it's a common assumption that you'll get slower if you start doing the longer stuff. But unless you're super fit, and we're talking about very fine detail here, for most people, if you run a lot more mileage and you're training with a few sessions, you're probably going to get a lot quicker at the 5K as well. So I hope so. That was my That's my hope. It's not worked out yet, but
Recently, you had the 10-year anniversary. It's a big moment, a decade of sober living. When you look back, do you afford yourself a sense of pride?
the amount of people, as far as I understand it, that have serious addictions to opiates and alcohol and that recover like I have, is tiny. Like, it's so small. So I feel really lucky. I think that's my main takeaway. I feel very lucky that somehow the world aligned and I had the brain and the people around me and the environment to lock all this together and to get me well in a way that means I have this life now. And I just feel really grateful and humble, and I just wish more people could have that experience, I suppose, because people are dying all the time from this, and society is not particularly sympathetic for understandable reasons. Like, people that drink and use drugs can be very problematic to society, and it's not just themselves they're hurting. It's really hard, but it's just so sad that so many people won't get those opportunities, and I just feel really grateful that I have them, and very lucky, I think, even though it's been such a hard road to get to this point.
Alan, thank you.
Thank you.
If you get something from these episodes, I have just a small request. If you could give the Jog On podcast a rating wherever you listen, and to go one step further, recommend us to a running friend who may also enjoy listening, it would help a lot. Thank you. Jog On now produces a newsletter which goes out only occasionally, provides a short read, and gives great value, from the best running tips to the latest news to free resources to help you improve your running. You can subscribe to the newsletter at thisisjogon.com. Thank you for watching and listening to the Jog On podcast. I'm Harry Morgan. Stay safe out there. Go for that run. And this is Jog On.